We ready to go? Yeah, good. Wonderful. Thank you, guys. It's great to see this lovely turnout, and very excited to be able to introduce our speaker. So my name is Amy Kaczynski. I teach here, and I run the Law and Political Economy Project with lots of other great humans, Yulia and Corinne and Sarah, who's not here. The energy that makes it all happen. So thank you, guys. So we're delighted to have here with us Umut Özsu, a distinguished scholar of public international law, the history and theory of international law, and Marxist critiques of law, rights, and state. He's a professor of law and legal studies at Carleton University in Canada. And today he's going to give us an overview of his latest book, Completing Humanity, the International Law of Decolonization, 1960 to 1982, a Cambridge University Press book, which Sam has helpfully profiled for you, which recounts the struggle to transform international law during the last major wave of decolonization, and documents and reassesses post-1945 decolonization from the standpoint of the third world and the jurists defending its interests. So Umut has also co-edited numerous other things, including the Research Handbook on Law and Marxism, a book on the extraterritoriality of law, and several journal symposia on international law and critical legal theory. He has an earlier book, Formalizing Displacement, International Law and Population Transfers. We're wonderfully lucky to also have Sam Moyn here, who is going to be in conversation after we hear a little bit about the book. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys, and thank you so much for coming and joining us from the Republic of Canada.
Thank you very much. Let me just try to get this microphone. Thank you very much, Amy, for that wonderful introduction. So I think everyone can hear me, right? Yeah? Okay, I'll try to sort of inch closer to this. So thank you all for having me here. This is a great honor, great privilege, and I'm very happy to see all of you and to meet many people in the flesh, in person, that I've been reading for a long time, but haven't had a chance to meet. And this is particularly nice given that one of the people who helped to organize this event is my former doctoral student, Hidya Fati, who's right here. But thank you very much to Corinne Blaylock, to Amy, to Sam, to everyone else involved in the LPE initiative. Some students and I were talking earlier, the LPE cell at Yale. Thank you all for helping to organize this. So what I thought I'd do is just take about 20-25 odd minutes just to sort of provide a general overview of what the book is all about, what I tried to do with the book, what the sort of core argument of the book is, architecturally, structurally, how it's organized, some of the specific themes and topics it is about. And then after that, we would, as planned, just sort of turn to a discussion with Sam and with all of you, and just sort of speak open-endedly, discuss open-endedly, some of the broader kind of themes that come out of all this. So at the beginning, just bear with me, I'll be reading from a prepared text just to sort of give you a bit of a brief overview of the book, and then we'll move on. Okay. So on October 24th, 1945, when the UN Charter entered into force, an estimated 750 million people, nearly a third of the world's entire total population, lived in territories under direct or indirect colonial rule. By the end of 1990, 30 years after it adopted the landmark Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, and also established a special committee to oversee the process of decolonization, this number had cratered to a few million, and the UN General Assembly felt enough pride in its track record to celebrate the inception of what it called an international decade for the eradication of colonialism. These decades, mind you, continue. They persist to the present day. We're currently on our fourth such decade. Today, roughly 70% of the world's population is descended from colonizers or colonial subjects, in many cases from both. The experiences of countless occupied territories, oppressed nations, unrecognized states, secessionist movements, and indigenous peoples to say nothing of those struggling against ongoing neocolonialism, make it clear that colonialism has never come to an end, and that it certainly cannot be reduced to the formal legal processes of decolonization coordinated by states and international organizations. Yet, the fact remains that over 80 states gained their independence within a single generation after the Second World War, with most colonial territories thereby reconstituted as states possessed of de jure sovereignty. Fewer than 2 million now live in the 17 territories that continue to be designated non-self-governing on the UN's admittedly incomplete and controversial list. Now, the question that I basically ask in the book is, how was it possible for a transformation on this scale to unfold so rapidly? What was international law's role in it? Decolonization as an historical process certainly did not arise ex nihilo after 1945. Its histories include the Haitian and Greek revolutions and the independence of settler states in the Americas during the late 18th and 19th centuries. Nor, for that matter, was decolonization ever limited spatially to Asia, Africa, Oceania, and the Caribbean. In Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, new states, or so-called new states, were created after the Second World War, as they were after the dissolution of the German, Ottoman, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires 2 decades earlier. The very term decolonization, which seems to have first appeared in print in 19th century discussions of France's occupation of Algeria and the Mexican-American War, was popularized during the interwar period by German emigre economist Moritz Bonn, who translated his neologism, Gegenkolonisation, into English as a way of conceptualizing what he regarded as a long-term, longue durée development stretching back to the American War of Independence, at least. Yet, the heyday of decolonization came after the establishment of the United Nations, an organization often distinguished from the League of Nations by its recognition of what one observer at the time called, quote, the need for accommodation in a revolutionary stage of transition. This was a time when nations and peoples the world over secured formal emancipation from colonial and semi-colonial rule. It was also a time when many pushed to fashion a new and fully decolonized, fully transformed international law. The specific dynamics and mechanisms differed from time to time and place to place. The removal of direct imperial control was a different matter, for instance, from the termination of a protectorate arrangement. A so-called peaceful transition in one territory might well be complemented by rebellions and counterinsurgency operations in a neighboring territory. Some colonial powers welcomed withdrawal as a means of shrugging off increasingly burdensome legal, financial, and administrative responsibilities, as well as the prospect of enhanced migration from colonies or former colonies. Others resorted to brutal violence to suppress independence movements, as well as related protests and uprisings. So my book, Completing Humanity, documents the rapid rise and even more rapid fall of what I regard as the most sustained attempt to decolonize international law ever undertaken. It commences in 1960, the year of the Decolonization Resolution, and it concludes in 1982 with the close of the Third UN Conference on the Law of the Sea and the onset of the Latin American debt crisis. The post-war push for decolonization began in the late 1940s and 1950s, unfolding alongside a boom in development planning. But its political and economic consequences made their forces felt on the plane of international law most fully during the 1960s and 1970s. Growth in the per capita income of many developing countries slowed during the 1950s and 1960s, and the UN designated the 1960s, 70s, and 80s as development decades. Formed in 1964, the year after the General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, became an important venue for discussions about economic development, particularly in regard to problems of so-called unequal exchange, the long-term secular downward trend in the price of primary commodities, especially those produced in peripheral states, or so-called peripheral states, relative to the price of manufactured goods, typically produced in core states, or states in the core of the world economy. By the mid-1970s, though, the post-war cycle of global economic expansion had sputtered to an end after years of declining rates of profit for many US and other firms, hard on the heels of the effective demise of the Bretton Woods monetary order following Nixon's decision to take the dollar off the gold standard in late 1971, and the first of the decade's 2 major oil crises in 1973-74. Building on deals they had struck with trade unions and working class movements during the interwar period, the national and transnational capitalist classes of the post-war North Atlantic had entrenched broadly Keynesian models of counter-cyclical demand management, partly through a significant expansion in the state's authority and capacity to provide social services. This had stabilized capitalist social relations in most industrialized countries, raising wages, employment levels, and rates of profit from the late 1940s through the mid-1960s, the core of what is still often regarded as a golden age for global capitalism. By the 1970s, however, competition-induced overproduction in the US and the introduction into its markets of goods from Western Europe and East Asia, particularly Japan and West Germany, increased pressure on US corporations and state institutions to weaken organized labor, drive down wages for domestic workers, jettison high-cost lines of production, relocate manufacturing abroad, and deregulate the financial sector. So my driver yesterday, when I was coming in from the airport, actually pointed out Bridgeport, Connecticut, as a place that had suffered from the relocation of manufacturing to China and elsewhere. These developments exposed the contradictions in the post-war class compromise, brought together through open distaste for Keynesian managerial techniques and a commitment to the price mechanism. Neoliberals like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman came to enjoy greater power at this juncture, jockeying for influence with socialist and partisan reform packages like the New International Economic Order, the NIEO for short, in a contest to reconfigure or restructure the world economy and the international division of labor that went along with it. A tumultuous tide of historical and political developments roiled these shifting forces. The Vietnam War, India's annexation of Goa, Daman, and Diu, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, colonial wars in Portuguese Angola, Guinea, and Mozambique, the 1967 and 1973 Arab-Israeli wars, conflicts and massacres in Cambodia, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Lebanon, Nigeria, and Pakistan, large numbers of national liberation movements that did not always prove amenable to tidy legal distinctions between international and non-international armed conflicts. These were also the years of second-wave feminism and the space race, the Soweto uprising and the Iranian Revolution, the 1975 Helsinki Accords and the strategic arms limitation talks, the measles vaccine and the 1972-75 worldwide food crisis. The normalization of neoliberal models of legal and economic reform, first in Europe and the US and then elsewhere, went hand in hand with the operational breakthrough, as Sam and others have termed it, of transatlantic human rights organizations, devoted in the first instance to combating torture and defending prisoners of conscience. Military dictatorships rose and fell in Southern Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere, even as anxieties about silent springs and limits to growth circled out of the fringes of environmentalist activism and economic policymaking to seep into popular consciousness. Now, it was in this rapidly changing political economic context that the last major waves of decolonization unfolded. Driven to achieve and reinforce their sovereignty and independence, states struggling with legacies of uneven colonial era development and often bundled together in a nominally uniform third world. The term third world is generally traced to a 1952 article by Alfred Sauvy, the French social scientist. They began to organize themselves on the international legal plane. They did so in significant part through the non-aligned movement and also the Group of 77, formed in 1961 and 1964 respectively. They also worked through UN bodies like UNCTAD, also established in 1964, as well as the General Assembly, particularly its fourth committee, which is responsible for considering, responsible for considering special political and decolonization-related issues, and its sixth committee, which is responsible for considering legal matters and producing draft treaties. Some of the new states, as they were called at the time, identified first and foremost as either capitalist or socialist, with differing interpretations of those terms in the offering. The majority, though, elected to position themselves as non-aligned, a term that Nehru had used in the late 1940s and that began to enjoy widespread popularity during the 1960s, often being used interchangeably with older and explicitly geographical expressions like Afro-Asian. As the debates of the 1960s gained steam, the ideological troika of capitalism, socialism, and non-alignment, or neutralism, as it was sometimes termed, gained increased visibility, circulating alongside post-war distinctions between developed and developing states. Now, what I argue in the book, at its core, is that this push to reconstitute international law came to the fore powerfully during this period, and that it found expression in a kind of dual strategy. On the one hand, jurists and diplomats from the predominantly non-aligned new states sought to conserve those elements of the international legal system generated after the Second World War and constitutionalized in the UN Charter that underscored the foundational status of sovereignty, non-intervention, and territorial integrity. The goal here was to harness international law's normative and ideological appeal in order to minimize foreign interference and support state-building projects designed to produce rapid and sustained socioeconomic transformations. Typically supported by their counterparts from socialist states, third world lawyers and diplomats defended those elements of international law they deemed useful for the achievement and consolidation of national sovereignty. State forms inherited from colonial rule or adapted from broadly European models, as well as the legal frameworks that formalized and legitimated them, were not necessarily to be cast aside so much as they were to be revamped, and in some cases partly radicalized, with a view to augmenting control of natural resources. Quote, perhaps it may even be said to be a matter of surprise that so much respect has been shown for the traditions of Western Europe, end quote, scoffed one US international law specialist in 1966. This is Charles Fenwick, turning his conceit into outright hostility by adding that this remained the case, quote, apart from occasional psychopathic reactions that relate rather to matters of policy than of general international law, end quote. Such arrogance aside, it was hard to deny that the further universalization of international law, even in substantially transformed form, facilitated the further universalization of both European state structures and the capitalist world economy to which they were integral. International law's expansion and development was at root a reflection of capitalism's own expansion and development. Now that's on the one hand. On the other hand, those who gave legal voice to the third world also underscored shared experiences of colonial and semi-colonial domination. They did so in order to establish collaborative institutions premised on shared need and mutual benefit. However committed they may have been to safeguarding their newfound sovereignty, those governing the world's newest states were keenly aware of their institutional limitations, as well as their economic dependence on the very powers from which they had recently liberated themselves. Most believed that cultivating trade partnerships, attracting foreign investment, consolidating political and military alliances, and fostering regional organizations with powers of functional coordination were all central to their security and prosperity, even their very survival. Julius Nyerere, the first prime minister and president of independent Tanganyika and longtime president of Tanzania, was widely influential for his vision of Ujamaa, a cooperative society led by a one-party state that prioritizes rural development, harnessing key industries and natural resources to this end, and in which collective ownership is instituted through the villagization of production, as he termed it. Notably, though, even Nyerere merged this commitment to national sovereignty with a broader commitment to building a new international order. Nyerere himself is widely known for his dedication to so-called self-reliance theory, the view that, as he put it, quote, a country or a village or a community cannot be developed, it can only develop itself. But he also affirmed the need for developing states and peoples to forge a common front on the model of an international trade union, admitting that prioritization of political and economic independence did not reduce their need for foreign aid, technical assistance, and capital investment. Most third world jurists and diplomats towed a similar line. They defended the developmental state as an engine of social transformation. At the same time, though, they were active participants in transnational and intergovernmental networks seeking to accelerate international law's own transformation. Cutting across social, geopolitical, and ideological lines, the third world's international lawyers frequently found themselves supporting mechanisms of interdependence that complicated their adherence to state sovereignty. Okay, so let me actually just put this down. Keep this.
Use that anymore.
No, I don't have to use this. Oh, okay. I can speak like this? Oh, awesome. Sorry if that was coming and going. If that was, okay. So what I try to do in the book, I can just continue from here, spontaneously, so to speak, is focus on 5 core concepts of international law. And I do them, and I do so in the context of 5 discussions, 5 debates that engaged jurists and diplomats from the third world, but jurists and diplomats and others, of course, from the so-called first and second worlds as well. So the 5 concepts are national or collective self-determination, that's my chapter 1. Jus cogens, so-called peremptory norms of general international law, that's chapter 2. the principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, that's chapter 3. The common heritage of mankind, as it was called at the time generally, the common heritage of humanity, as we're now wont to call it, that's chapter 4. And the international right to development, not right to development on the domestic level, but at the level of international law, and that's chapter 5. Instead of kind of looking at these 5 core concepts, 5 core terms in the abstract, I try to drill down to specific instances of negotiation, bargaining, and contestation. So in the case of the chapter 1, the chapter on self-determination, what I really focus on there, and this is something that Sam and I have worked on independently as well for a separate project, is the so-called Friendly Relations Declaration. The Friendly Relations Declaration is an important General Assembly declaration from 1970, October 1970, but it was worked up over the course of the 1960s. So from about 1963 all the way through 1970, there's a special committee that's constituted by the General Assembly and tasked with drafting this declaration for the General Assembly eventually to adopt. So what I do there is track all of the debates with regard to self-determination that took place within that special committee that the General Assembly created in the 1960s, all the way up to and including 1970, October 1970, when that declaration was adopted. And those debates, of course, they had mammoth implications. So, their implications ran from threat or use of force by one state against another state, to contemporaneous developments like the Vietnam War, to Cold War rivalries, of course, between the US and the USSR in the first instance, but more generally, to the incorporation of non-aligned views, and how seriously they were to be taken for the purposes of reconceiving self-determination 25 years after the adoption of the UN Charter in 1945. The Friendly Relations Declaration was deliberately adopted on the 25th anniversary of the UN Charter as a kind of canonization of the core principles of the UN Charter, right? So trying to actually unpack the contests through which the Friendly Relations Declaration came to be what it was, and through which self-determination came to be presented in the way that it was in that declaration is what I tried to do in chapter 1. Chapter 2, I tried to do something similar with Jus Cogens. In this case, I look at the Vienna Conference on the Law of Treaties. So this is a conference that takes place in 1968-69 in 2 sessions in Vienna. And here you get a codification of the law of treaties, right? All of the customary international law rules with respect to treaty making, treaty breaking, treaty amendment, all of that stuff get codified at this conference. And of course, one of the questions that really comes to the fore during this conference is, how seriously is this notion of jus cogens, which is a notion in domestic law, particularly in the civil law tradition, to be taken at the level of international law? Is it to be imported into international law? If so, how so? Are we, for instance, going to have the kind of laundry list of specific jus cogens norms, specific norms or rules that are deemed to be so peremptory, so imperative, that you can't possibly violate them or breach them? Are we supposed to have a list like that in the resulting treaty itself? So as you can imagine, here too, we have a debate, and here too, as in the case of the Friendly Relations Declaration special committee debates, you've got a division between, on the one hand, the advanced capitalist countries, as they styled themselves at the time, the industrialized countries of the first world, on the one hand, and on the other hand, for the most part, the second and third worlds, acting en bloc, really. And so you get here the socialist, or so-called socialist, and non-aligned states really going to bat for the idea of jus cogens. In a variety of Western capitalist states, in particular France and the United States, voicing opposition to the incorporation of jus cogens into the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Nevertheless, it gets incorporated. So I look at there these specific negotiations around what became Article 53 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. So I'm focusing on very specific texts, right? The Friendly Relations Declaration, this specific provision in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and trying to actually tease out the way in which we got there, right? Trying to reconstruct the debates that led to these compromises that were enshrined in these texts. The third chapter is about permanent sovereignty over natural resources. There, I look at the New International Economic Order Project, so the NIO project. And in particular, I look at 3 General Assembly resolutions from 1974. These resolutions, 2 of these resolutions were adopted on May Day, 1974, May 1st. The Declaration on the Establishment of the New International Economic Order, the Program of Action for the New International Economic Order, and then following one, the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, Sam has written extensively about all these instruments as well, was adopted in December of that year. Now, the long story of the NIO project, a lot of historians, a lot of international legal scholars, including historians of international law, have written about this in recent years, goes back, of course, into the 1960s and even further back into the 1950s, and some people would argue even further back into the interwar period and so on. The conceptual genealogy of this goes back a long ways, but I really look at the arguments about the drafting of those NIO-related instruments in 1974, and in particular, I concentrate on what they have to say, where they have to say anything at all, about expropriation, nationalization, confiscation of the assets of foreign investors, the properties of foreign investors, right? So the example that I always use in Canada, for my own students, is there are a lot of Canadian mining operations, Canadian mining companies that operate abroad, Latin America, Africa, elsewhere. If you've got a Canadian mining company like Inco, for example, operating in Zambia, say, right? Zambia is rich in copper. There are certain conditions. There are certain legal conditions under which it operates. So those conditions are typically formalized in a concession agreement or an international treaty or some other set of legal instruments. Now, what do those legal instruments say about the conditions under which the host state of investment can go about expropriating and nationalizing the assets of a foreign investor, in this case, a foreign company, right? Under which conditions, if any, can they do so, and what happens as a result? So the question here really turns on the kind of compensation that the host state is duty-bound, is obligated to provide to the foreign investor or the state that backs the foreign investor in the event of nationalization. The third world in particular, and again, the third world's interests here are supported by the second world. The third world argues that either no legal duty to provide compensation should be the norm, or that at the very least, in the event that compensation has to be provided, the authority that gets to determine the quantity of that compensation and the procedure through which that compensation, the amount of that compensation is determined, all of that should be done by domestic institutions, by courts in the host state, and in accordance with domestic law, not in accordance with international law. Now, this is a step forward for the third world at the time, but it is, of course, not something that the Henry Kissingers of the world at the time, or the relevant Canadian officials, not to pick on the Americans too much, are terribly keen on, right? And so you get here too a series of far-reaching debates over what state sovereignty actually entails, what popular sovereignty entails, what expropriation and nationalization actually mean under international law, and what forms of compensation, if any, are to be provided. Right? So if Libya wants to nationalize its oil assets, right, controlled and operated by foreigners, then how does this work? What are the legal consequences arising therefrom? Okay. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4 is about the common heritage of mankind, as it was called at the time. Now, rightly, we refer to it as common heritage of humanity or humankind. And in particular, I look at the law of the sea. So the third UN Conference on the Law of the Sea really sort of commenced in 1973 and went on all the way until 1982. This is famously, notoriously, of course, the resulting Convention on the Law of the Sea is famously one of the most complicated of all international treaties. For those of us who teach public international law, the supplement to most of our textbook contains the treaties that we refer students to in the Law of the Sea, to the extent that it's not, given an abbreviated form, basically takes up like half or 2/3 of that supplement, right? It's a long, winding treaty and so on. But the common heritage concept figured prominently in the debates, in the negotiations for the Convention on the Law of the Sea, particularly in regard to deep seabed mining. So the person who really has done sterling work in this respect is Surabhi Ranganathan at Cambridge University. And I relied extensively on her work, as well as the work of others at Kate Storr and so on, in order to mine the different perspectives that were on offer from the third world, from the second world, from the first world, and so on, with respect to deep seabed mining. Now, I won't go into all the details, but really the gist of the debate here was that the third world, backed for the most part by the second world. Here we have a bit of a difference because the Soviet Union happens to be a large industrialized power with extensive maritime technology. The technology is sophisticated enough to actually engage in deep seabed mining, going and mining nickel and manganese and copper off the ocean floor beyond the bounds of national jurisdiction. There are only a few such states at the time that have this technology. The Soviets are one of them. But here, for the most part, the third world is really pressing for an international organization that will actually control, manage, and administer the entire regime of deep seabed mining, and then take the resulting profits or revenues and distribute them equitably on a global plane, in such a way as to, for example, take the interests of landlocked countries into consideration, or the interests of poor countries that don't have the technology necessary to go out and mine the deep seabed in the middle of the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean center. Right? The first world, on the other hand, wants a concessionary system, a concessionary regime. So let's actually create a system in which states or state agencies or the private corporations that are registered or headquartered in particular states can get a license in order to mine a particular area of the deep seabed. And then there will be certain obligations on them to transfer technology or do this and that. Well, what ends up happening again is a compromise between these two basic positions. In this instance, importantly, as I just noted, the Soviet Union actually somewhat sides with the leading industrialized states of the global north, again, because it does actually have the technology that's needed to go out and do all this. But for the most part, again, you have the first world versus second world, third world kind of debate here unfolding. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, Article 153 of the Convention on the Law of the Sea really enshrines all of this. You get what's called a parallel system of deep seabed mining, a sort of private-public joint partnership, as it were. So you get an International Seabed Authority that's now headquartered in Kingston, Jamaica. You get an International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea that's now headquartered in Hamburg, in Germany. The Seabed Authority can both conduct exploration and exploitation of the deep seabed on its own terms, and issue licenses, concessions essentially, to private corporations or public entities or to states to do that as well. And there's a kind of side story in all of this that relates to the United States. The United States, of course, is not even today a state party of the Convention on the Law of the Sea. The country that I happen to be born in, Turkey, is not as well, as a result of complex maritime disputes with Greece and so on. Not every state signs up to every treaty, let alone ratifies it. But in the U.S. case, what ends up happening is that from 1982, when the convention is adopted, all the way to 1994, in particular from about 1989, 1990 to 94, there are attempts by UN diplomats to try to bring the U.S. within the fold of this new Law of the Sea regime. And so a special agreement, a implementation agreement, is actually negotiated specifically for the US, and it kind of waters down, dilutes some of these obligations to transfer technology and so on and so forth. The US still doesn't sign the convention. The fifth and final, and here I'll stop, the fifth and final chapter is about the international right to development. And here what I do is actually, I look at not treaty-making negotiations per se, but I look at the work of the so-called Grand Commission, the North-South Commission, as it was called. This was a commission that was set up by the World Bank under the auspices of Robert McNamara, and it was headed up by former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, and it was a sort of international alliance of experts that were recruited to voice their views and provide their input on pretty much everything that was wrong with the world at the time. So a kind of smorgasbord of topics, right? Everything from food security and sovereignty to issues about territorial integrity, issues of course about uneven development, unequal exchange. And what you got there were two reports that were published in 1980 and 1983 respectively by the Grand Commission, with a slew of policy recommendations, including some legal recommendations as well. What I do is look at the way development and human rights and basic needs, which was, again, Sam has written extensively on basic needs and others have as well, which was a real lodestone in World Bank policy discourse during the 1970s, outside of the World Bank as well. These notions, I look at the way these notions of development, human rights, and basic needs were fused, sometimes not terribly coherently, in the Brand Commission's reports, and how they fed into a lot of the other broader debates about the relationship between the right to development and international human rights law more generally at the time. And those debates, of course, involved people like Philip Alston. They involved, actually, interestingly, one of the very first things that noted critical international law scholar David Kennedy writes for publication purposes is actually a review in a German journal of a conference, an important conference that Olson and others participated in 1980, if memory serves, on specifically these issues: development, human rights, the rule of law, and so on and so forth. And so that's the sort of constellation, right? In 1986, at the end of the day, after the sort of bookend of my book, you get the UN General Assembly, of course, adopting a declaration on the right to development and so on. That doesn't get taken terribly seriously, as most such resolutions, legally non-binding and politically, fairly weak, on account of the fact that they're legally binding and politically weak. But nevertheless, it sort of caps a lot of these debates as well. So, yeah, I'll stop there. I just wanted to sort of provide a brief overview, and then let's begin the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, well, amazing. Thanks, first of all, to the organizers for bringing Umut, who is really one of the leading scholars in this area. We have, I think, 40 minutes, and I really want you to have the chance to ask questions. So raise your hand at any time. My rough idea was I'll ask a few questions about the book, and given any minutes left, I can transition to asking Umut, who's also a kind of Marxist theorist of law, the second to visit this week, about his views on that score. But really, the most important thing is for you to engage with them. So I'll keep an eye out and just raise your hand at any time. Umut's a little modest in this book. He says it's not comprehensive, and of course it's true that it's 5 essays, they're interlinked, but it's far and away the best thing that's been written on any of the topics concerned, and really in the aggregate on the transformation of international law in this extraordinary period of transformation. And yet, you say it was a failure. So, I mean, I guess I want to begin by asking whether your goal was to write in a sense, deflationary book. Yeah. And if it was a failure, why write about it? I'm just looking at page 244. This book has charted the history of a failure. So, was it, in what way, why write about it if it failed?
I can jump on that, yeah. No, I mean, I think insofar as we're talking about a semi-coordinated project of transforming or decolonizing international law systemically, it was undoubtedly a failure. International law has indeed been transformed in a lot of different ways, but it hasn't been transformed, it hasn't been subject to that kind of wholesale top-to-bottom transformation for a whole lot of reasons, of course. It would be pure idealism of a sort that I, as a Marxist, cannot partake of to claim or assume that international lawyers could, simply sort of graft new techniques or new modules or new codes onto various assets in order to produce different forms of capital or different forms of law. International lawyers don't have this kind of political or economic power, obviously. There are inherent structural limitations within which international lawyers operate. What I wanted to do, in part, was to actually sort of write a prehistory of TWAIL. Right? And this goes to the failure directly. TWAIL, as it was sort of assembled in the 1990s at Harvard Law School, but increasingly elsewhere, and as it's become a sort of multinodal, heterogeneous, global network of scholars and activists and so on in the years following, it's taken on very deflationary tones, right? So what is oftentimes sort of retroactively canonized as Twale 2, the second generation of Twale, from the 90s onwards. So people like Antony Angie, Balakrishna Rajagopal, all great mentors. Angie was good enough to blurb this particular book. Much of their work is deflationary in the sense that it's aimed towards liberal, dare I say it, mainstream international lawyers or advocates of international law who assume that international law is fighting the good fight, that for all its faults, all its imperfections, it bends eventually towards progress, and so on and so forth. And what they're trying to do is from its very inception, however we understand it, however we date it. In Engie's case, he begins with Vittoria, Muscula Salamanca, the so-called conquest of the New World, and so on by the Spanish. The inception of international law in anything like its modern form, that is saturated, just shot through with imperialism, with colonialism, with a whole variety of deeply racialized, deeply classist assumptions about different polities, interactions with different polities, and so on. Now, this is a very, very powerful move. What I wanted to do, and I, of course, subscribe to it and build upon it in the book and in other writings. What I wanted to do, though, was something a bit different, right? What I wanted to do was, without actually sort of allowing this project to sort of get funneled into a Twale framework, or specifically Twale-oriented lens, I wanted to actually go back and just look at what these folks in the 1960s and 70s were saying, writing, and doing. So, when I spoke to someone like Georges Abissab, or when I spoke to B.S. Chimney, who was a bit younger, he was going through grad school at Yale University in India in the 1970s and so on, they were, of course, they predate the inception of what we now call Twale by 15, 20 odd years, right? How did they actually position themselves? How did they situate themselves within the international legal community, such as it is? Professionally speaking, how did they operate within and outside of the UN? Which groups, which networks, like, for example, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, right? Did they, form alliances with? All of that. In that sense, I didn't want the book to be a sort of deflationary book, from the outset, or to assume deflation, as it were, to assume failure from the very outset. I wanted to demonstrate it, right? I wanted to demonstrate it by looking at particular struggles. So here's a particular, set of social struggles that is being waged, admittedly, in a highly mediated and highly abstract form at the level of, these treaty-making conferences and diplomatic meetings, in Geneva and New York and elsewhere and so on. Here are a series of struggles waged by people overwhelmingly from the third world, on behalf of what they regard, at least, rightly or wrongly, as the fundamental interests and values of the third world, right? And in each case, of course, there is either a failure or a compromise, a dilution, right? So you get, in the case of the common heritage of humanity principle, right, you get this private-public, licensing slash sort of international seabed authority type regime, right? So it's not exactly what the third world wants, but it's a little bit of it. And then the implementation agreement that gets carved out for the Americans in 1994 dilutes it even further. So you've got people like R.P. Anand, the very important Indian international lawyer, one of the forerunners of critical international legal studies in India, saying, well, the United States gets all it wants, and this is basically diluted the idea, the very idea of common heritage to the point where it means nothing anymore, and blah blah blah. So I didn't necessarily want to
begin with the premise of failure. I wanted to actually demonstrate it. I want to get to it.
Okay, great. I would totally say that there was, in a sense, a need, at least as historians and observers have written about things lately, for a dose of deflation. The blurb is dead according to the New York Times, but I was sitting here wondering, of your four blurbers, which did not overhype the new international economic order, and maybe all four, committed that sin and many others. And you're pretty devastating by that point in the story. But then I guess I'm wondering if your goal was to like reach failure by the end of the story, but not assume it in advance, then you write these essays that are about the negotiation of instruments, or the writing of a report in the case of the last. And what did you take away, using any examples of the kind of opportunities and limits within those processes? Because presumably we would want to know, well, was the failure foreordained and people just didn't realize it? You know, you can't use the master's tools, blah, blah, like international law and inheritance is the last thing you would expect to be decolonized, and it still isn't. Or were there like big chances that were missed in this period? Are there promising moments that you feel that you dramatized in spite of the climactic failure that you diagnose?
No, I mean, this is in some sense, like, I'm dating myself here, but there used to be a show on American TV, you know, $60,000 question or $70,000 question, something of that sort, right? This is the big question to some degree. So what I would say is that, you know, there's no doubt that international law, or what we now call international law, right? The term international law is really coined by Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century, and you know, is structured in such a way that many of these struggles are doomed from the outset to some degree, or that they're doomed to be curtailed or circumscribed or you know, limited and restricted in important ways. But nevertheless, you know, my approach has always been, you know, to see international law, what we call international law, as something of a tilted, skewed site of contestation. As cliched as that expression is, I do think that that's actually, in fact, what is going on. So, you know, to sneak in some of the Marxism here, there are many forms of Marxism. There are many, you know, different readings and interpretations of Marx and Engels and many others on offer. But I personally don't subscribe, for instance, to, you know, a Pashukanist vision of law, according to which, you know, Pashukanist was an early Bolshevik, early Soviet legal theorist, who famously tried to build a theory of law on the basis of the opening chapters of Capital One. And so what he really tries to argue there is that the commodity form is replicated or has its parallel in the legal form. And he speaks, you know, in these abstract in terms about the legal form as such. Now, I have doubts about whether you can do that. I think it's meaningful in Marx to speak about the commodity form, the value form, and so on. I don't think Marx actually, you know, subscribes to the view that law can be reduced to a singular super-historical form of that kind. But if you subscribe to this kind of Pashukanist theory of law, you also subscribe, as Pashukanist does, to a fairly strict base superstructure model, right? So, you know, this idea that we get replicated in orthodox or traditional Marxism, that there is an economic base and a non-economic superstructure. So the economic base is your means and relations of production, and your non-economic superstructure is pretty much everything else, right? So law, culture, ideology, the state, rights, morality, you know, all of this other stuff, right? And the idea, at least as propounded by, you know, the second international theoreticians of the 1890s and the 1900s, or in Stalinism, for example, Orthodox Stalinism in the 1930s and so on, is that the base is really, you know, the primary driver or motor or engine of social development, social change, and that the non-economic superstructural forms are just that, they're secondary and derivative. Now, what ends up happening is that this model actually breaks down. It breaks down even on Marx and Engels' very terms, as they themselves understand it. Engels, in the 1890s, is writing letters to friends like Conrad Schmidt, saying, Joseph Bloch and others, saying routinely, look, we never intended the base superstructure model to be understood in this mechanical unidirectional way. We never stripped the superstructure of what we would now, as socio-legal scholars and students, call constitutive power. Of course it feeds back into the making and unmaking and reshaping of the base, the so-called base.
right? It's not that the base is driving everything and the superstructure is simply epiphenomenal. No, the superstructure is actually feeding back into the constitutional operation, the functioning of the base as well. So you've got this kind of feedback loop to some degree, right? Of course, what's paramount is the base on Marxist model. There's no doubt about that. But the superstructure is not to be sort of derided or cast aside entirely. Now, if you take that kind of approach, just as a quick aside, the base superstructure model doesn't actually appear very often in Marx's own works, right? So the locus classicus of this is the preface to a critique of the contribution of political economy, and then you've got an important but fairly short reference to that piece in Capital One as well. So these are important, textual reference, and there are others, of course, as well. But much has been made of the base superstructure model, and it has been converted into just that, a model. Whereas, it was really, as Igor Shchoikov and others rightly note, it was always intended by Marx and Engels and others as a metaphor, as a model in the looser sense, right? In the way that physicists, cosmologists, concoct models to actually sort of make sense, render intelligible a great deal of different phenomena. And so, yeah, if you move away from a Pasha-Khanasite theory of law, if you move away from a strict base superstructure distinction, if you move away from the idea that law equals capitalism, or that the only form of law is capitalist law, that there can be no such thing as a pre-capitalist law or a non-capitalist law, let alone a workers' law, a proletarian law, right? And that was it's something that Marx explicitly recognized, not only the possibility of, but the necessity for in the critique of the Gotha program in 1875, which is one of the last important things that he writes. He explicitly talks about the transition from a bourgeois state to a worker state to full communism. And the worker state has the coercive and distributive powers necessary for democratizing and transforming social relations in such a way as to make possible the withering away of the state and its laws, the abolition of the state and its laws. You need first the expropriation of the expropriators that Marx talks about in Capital, and then you've got the proletarian state, and then you've got full communism. It's a kind of stagist, not in the Stalinist sense, but a kind of phasic transition there. If you adopt a different approach from that, a different Marxist approach from that, I build my work, for example, on the back oftentimes of Nikos Boulantzas, the Greek, French, Marxist state theorists from the 1970s, 1960s and 70s, then you're going to actually come out with a different result. You're going to see law as a contested terrain that is not contested in a neutral or even-handed way, of course, right? It's not as though the capitalist class and the proletariat have equal rights and opportunities and resources available to them, and they're just contesting things like the Democratic and Republican parties. Even there, it's not entirely equal. But nevertheless, it is a contested terrain. Why? Because the state is, according to Boulantzas, the condensation and the crystallization of the social relations that crisscross the entirety, the totality of capitalist society, right? So insofar as the capital relation, the relation between workers and capitalists, informs the very bedrock of capitalist society, you've got that replicated in the state's institutions and in the state's ideology as well to some degree, right? Now, there are all sorts of problems and all sorts of advantages to all sorts of different ways of building a Marxist theory of law based on different readings of different portions of Marx and so on. But if you subscribe to that kind of broadly, what I could call Poulantzasian theory of law, then you get a bit of a different take, right? At that point, it's not necessarily a story in these chapters in the book of struggles that were predestined to fail or fail in a particular way. Those struggles could have yielded different outcomes, different results, not necessarily the results that the Third World hoped for. And in fact, when you speak to people like Georges Abissab and other forerunners of what we now call quail, these people were incredibly realistic, incredibly sober, and politically astute. They were not given to sort of romantic, romanticism with respect to transforming international law all in one fell swoop and so on. But they nevertheless believed that specific innovations or specific developments could be made for the better.
So I'm rambling, but that's.
No, it's amazing. I mean, I don't want to take up that much more time, but okay, Asla.
I mean, I'm just gonna follow up on that last place that you stopped, because if you take that account of Abisab, Anand, others, then it kind of makes me wonder why adopt a binary frame of success or failure? Like, what does it mean to say the project failed if the project was a sober and realistic account of the limitations of what can be transformed, but also creating spaces or opportunities that themselves will unfold in time? So like, it's one of those famous things of like, are we there yet? Do we know whether it's failed? I mean, when would we know? A century from now? Like, at what point would we have any way of measuring the impact of thinking along the lines of the new international economic order when the actors that were articulating that project had agency qua state for, a heartbeat, basically, and were already beginning to contest the terms on which trade was being imposed on them. So, so how do you think about those kinds of questions in light of the theoretical apparatus you are bringing to bear? And then, maybe a little bit, and I think this might be interesting for the students in the room also, why these 5 episodes? I mean, are there other episodes that might look more like even success on their own terms? I get the I almost want to say romance of the deflationary move. Sam has trained all of us in that, I think, who are institutionally in conversation with him. But, are there other things to be rescued from this period? And what would have happened if, for example, the story was about CERD's negotiation? Like, how might that story cut against or tell a different version of what can be achieved immediately, what is the medium-term consequence of even compromises, and then at what point, at what longue durée would we be in a position to make an assessment about success or failure?
That's fascinating. A wide range, difficult for me to answer, but in the first instance, when you first said, the binary success failure, where my mind went was Nils Gilman has a wonderful piece on the NIEO. There was a dossier, a symposium in the journal Humanity that Sam was involved in, that Nils and Sam and others put together at the NIEO around 2015, I want to say. And Engie was in there and so on and so forth. But Nils actually has an introduction there where he specifically addresses this point. And the term that he uses is unfailure. The NIEO's unfailure. That it's not necessarily a failure as such, failure full stop, period. It's a kind of, something that falls well short of what we would expect from a success, but nevertheless has these residual afterlives, these after effects that continue to sort of percolate in different contexts, right? So the international right to development, for instance, is an example to some degree of that. You've got all of these debates about development and human rights and so on in the 1970s into the 1980s. You've got another reason I choose 1982 as a sort of bookend for the book is that in October 1981, you get the famous Cancun Summit, the North-South Summit, at which Thatcher and Reagan, newly installed, of course, famously reject all the recommendations of the Brand Commission. They actually say, this is rubbish, we're going to lay it aside, and so on. But nevertheless, this work continues within and outside of the UN. And of course, you get these declarations on the right to development and many, many other declarations. When I teach public international law, I have an entire module on international indigenous law. And much of the work of actually building up what we now call international indigenous law, both soft and hard law, really from the 1980s, 1990s. Before that, much of it is really ILO law. It's various policy documents, recommendations from the International Labour Organization. So I think that idea of unfailure might be a way of sort of complicating this binary. I don't make much of the sort of success, quote unquote, versus failure, quote unquote, kind of dichotomy, because I'm really interested, as a kind of amateur historian of international law, I'm really interested in just tracking these deliberations and debates, right, on their own terms, and then showing this is the result. But very much so. This continues to the present day. There's a convention on the right to development that is in circulation. All of these things kind of exist in draft form for 10, 15 years because of various state opposition and so on. But then come to a head. The second part of your question, if you could just...
The 5.
Oh, the 5, and not others, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, absolutely, these are really no more than 5 snapshots, as I put it in the introduction, 5 snapshots, 5 glimpses into the broader debates that decolonization threw up on the international legal plane at the time. So, for instance, One area that I don't do is international criminal and humanitarian law. And Lloyd van Dijk and others have done wonderful work. Nahal Bhuta at the University of Edinburgh does a lot of this work. It's coming out with a lot of work that actually touches on state theory, many others. Right? There are many fields and subfields of what we call public international law or other cognate areas that could be looked at here, absolutely, right? So I've deliberately chosen these 5 very abstract, very imprecise terms. Okay? National self-determination. I mean, all the questions, I'm originally from Turkey, right? All the questions with respect to sub-state groups, minority groups, and so on. Who is a minority? Who's a majority? What rights structure the relations between those groups? What does territorial sovereignty mean? What does multipossiditis mean? Mammoth, implications here. Jus cogens, common heritage of mankind, permanent sovereignty, right to develop. These are all very vague terms, right? I like that vagueness. I like the vagueness of jus cogens the most, actually, because it's the most universal concept. It's in some sense the most empty, but also the one with the most potential for that reason as well. But yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, there are lots of different areas that could be looked at this. So there's no claim to comprehensiveness or exhaustiveness on my part with respect to this. I'm trying to delve deep into specific conjunctures and specific contexts.
Amy.
Great, this is so interesting, and I wanted to ask you, I guess maybe a little bit of connecting the book to Marxist theory and sort of unpacking some of your view of this sort of Polancian or view that you might be describing. And I'm going to back up and sort of like one area that I've worked on quite extensively is the TRIPS agreement and the WTO. And I was trying to think about like how I think about the dynamics that you're describing in this setting. And one issue that comes up is, countries sign these agreements and then they agree, for example, we'll allow patents, in 20 years and so forth. And the question is like, is this a good deal? Is this a bad deal? And one of the things working on that from the ground that you often come up against is, well, this particular state, whether it's the Indian state or the Brazilian state, in certain regards may be representing national interests, in other regards may be representing class interests. And like it's a pretty good deal for a certain, you may get some foreign export, you may get some foreign direct investment, you may get some, and so this raises a whole like question in a way about your method. So like when you work on international law and you take representatives of states and how they meet at this moment, what does it mean to do that work through a Marxist lens? And maybe a technical way to ask that would be, Poulantzas is describing the state as itself a product of these kind of class struggle forces. But then you're producing an analysis focused on state actors who are struggling with one another, right? And like, why would you expect that to produce something that would be the outworking of class, it's like the international layering of this seems like a really interesting problem for a Marxist theorist. And in a longer arc, I'm also curious, and this is like maybe too big of a question, but what's your view about what kind of alternative political economy might be built beyond capitalism, and what role states and national sovereignty and the state authorities that you're writing about, including the decolonial ones, play in that order?
So this is wonderful. This is fantastic. So the first part, I'll try to tackle that. Try to do my best with that. So it's absolutely true that when you're looking at debates that play out on the level of international law specifically, you're talking about jurists, diplomats, state functionaries, officials, employed by and purporting to or represent the interests of entire states, right? And in some cases, alliances of states or groupings of states, right? So someone like Mohammed Bajawi, for example, he's not only an ambassador to France on behalf of Algeria, he's not only an advisor to the FLN during the 1950s and 1960s, negotiating the terms of Algeria's independence with France in 1962, but he's also involved in the Arab League, he's also involved in the UN, he's also involved in the ICJ, he becomes president of the ICJ in the 1990s, all of these other fora and so on. So how does nation and class, sort of the tension between nation and class figure in all of this? Absolutely. So the first thing to note that I do try to note in the introduction is that a lot of these figures, had a specific class background, right? So socioeconomically, when you look at the Georges Abissabs, the Arpianons, and so on, the Taslim Diases, you're dealing typically with people with a middle class background or an upper class background, who typically have a particular kind of professional trajectory, a particular kind of training and formation story as well. So yeah, typically they will be trained at least partly, if not wholly, in Europe or the United States, in France or Switzerland, the US, and so on. Typically it'll be in law, but also in conjunction with some other disciplines. So in August Saab's case, for example, he studies economics and politics, if memory serves. I think he actually studies, if memory serves, economics at the University of Michigan to some degree for a while. And then, of course, establishes himself as an international lawyer. There's this kind of mixture. So right there, right, you've got middle and upper class folks who have undergone a kind of elite formation, elite training, right? I mean, I'm influenced by Bourdieu as well, so I'm always kind of harkening back to like what Bourdieu writes about the state nobility and so on and so forth, right? And they're representing, or purporting to represent, or tasked with representing and voicing the views of an entire state as such, right? So what ends up happening, of course, is that in many cases, the view or the perspective that is advanced on behalf of a particular state is in fact the view or the perspective of a particular class, or a particular elite structure, a particular comprador class, or a national bourgeoisie, a particular constellation of forces, the particular balance of forces in that state AB, rendered international, rendered intelligible for an international audience, right? Now, that's not always the case, right? So it depends. It depends on which state we're talking about, at which conjuncture, right? In which context, and what kind of argument that they're making. So, those arguments can sometimes, the arguments that international lawyers make in these kind of treaty-making conferences can sometimes actually articulate the demands of workers and peasants. I mean, they oftentimes do. Now, the critique that I make about, for example, the NIEO, about the structural limitations inherent in each of these endeavors, is very, very sympathetic to exactly what you said, in the sense that in the context of the NIEO, what people like Samuel Moyn, Andre Gunder Frank, other people involved in dependency theory, and of course Raoul Prebisch and others in the dependency schools, but kind of proto-world systems theorists in the 1970s are saying about the NIEO is that, look, this is just a way of restructuring or shifting around, tinkering around the edges, reformist reform style with the International Division of Labor. So what you want is a capitalist world economy, but you want a capitalist world economy that isn't, rife with north-south inequality in precisely the same way that it is now. And so you want greater production, greater industrialization in the south. Boumediene, for example, when he takes the podium in 1974 to launch the NIEO at the special session of the General Assembly, actually talks about Algeria has engaged in austerity in order to support its industrialization process so that it can be a more productive and a more powerful country within the world economy and so on. This is very much the kind of elite view of industrialization that a lot of these folks are voicing. But there are other arguments as well. It depends on the context. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the perspective or argument being offered on behalf of a state is necessarily always just an expression of the bourgeoisie that runs the state as though it were an executive committee, right? I think that's too simple. That is the case for many states and many representatives of states, but it isn't the case, across the board. And the second one was about the future. Yeah, listen, when it comes to this stuff, I mean, Marx famously in the preface to the second German edition of Capital One, I think it was, talks about how he's not in the business of writing recipes for the cook shops of the future, right? So he deliberately eschews this kind of romanticized, speculative business of sort of conceiving or imagining a post-capitalist future and hoping or aspiring to achieve it, or even struggling to achieve it in the way that anarchists, with whom he didn't necessarily get along all that well, but had respect for and sort of took ideas from in various ways, we're trying to do, right? So what I would say about this is that I'm happy to consider, right, post-capitalist futures of all kinds. But I'm not terribly interested in imagining a communal future. This kind of work, which has become very popular of late, right? And it's oftentimes, it really finds expression in a lot of the work that people do around decolonization-related issues as well. What Marx says, for example, in the Critique of the Growth of Progress, is that you get this kind of stage-by-stage, phase-by-phase dissolution of the capitalist order and its supersession, its transformation into a post-capitalist social relations, which no longer need mediating, alienating institutions like state institutions or legal institutions and so on. But he doesn't regard that as just one leap into the abyss. Neither, for that matter, does Lenin in The State and Revolution, right? 1917, unfinished essay, key essay. In both cases, there's a sort of phasic transition, right? So you get the expropriation of the expropriators, you get the establishment of a proletarian state with these coercive and distributive powers, which undertakes the social transformation necessary in order to do away with the very need for alienating institutions like the state. And then, and only then, do you get the kind of, full communism for which anarchists, anarcho-communists, even, sort of left accelerationist types today and so on, hope for, right? So that's what I would say. I mean, I'm all for post-capitalism, for doing away with capitalism. I just don't think we're going to make any headway by calling for it or demanding for it.
Okay, is there a last short question? Okay, sure.
Yeah, it's great to hear your talk. I'm also teaching public international law in China, currently visiting the Hong Center. My question is, upon your research, do you think there's fundamental differences from the third world, where Marxism dominates, about the function of international law from those views from the third or first world? The second question is, I like the title of your book. I want to ask, what do you mean humanity in the context of the current international legal order?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, the title, Completing Humanity, the idea was to suggest that part of the project of decolonizing or transforming international law was to actually move away from classical and even post-classical UN-related international law and create or construct over the medium to long term, if not the short term, a new international law that would do justice to the demands and aspirations and grievances of the third world and to, indeed to everyone, right? So this was the idea was to sort of complete this process. There's a kind of Hegelian undercurrent here, right? In that sense. Well, the first part of your question, it's interesting. As I understood it, you were talking about different perspectives on what international law is among third world jurists and first world jurists, but third world jurists of a Marxist orientation, I think you were saying. Yeah, so I mean, one very good example, for instance, of two very good examples of international lawyers from this period who are Marxists or very close to Marxism, and who, interestingly, do not have the kind of class background that many of these other folks do, are Mohammed Bajawi and Issa Shidji. So Mohammed Bajawi is an orphan, comes from a very modest background socially, does not have the kind of elite formation story that a lot of these other folks do, but nevertheless undertakes training in law and political science in Algeria as well as France and so on and so forth. Issa Shidji is a Marxist legal scholar who writes on international human rights law, not so much public international law as we would understand, or UN law per se, but international human rights law, domestic human rights law, but also just works on land reform, class struggles in Tanzania and East Africa more generally. So he's based in Tanzania. He's part of the sort of Dar es Salaam school, as it's known at the time, and that involves other people, Walter Rodney and others, and so on come through. Those folks have a very different, and they have different conceptions of international law from between each other as well, but they have a very different perspective on what human rights, for example, means, and the failures or successes of human rights in different operational contexts than the folks in the North who are writing about human rights at the time. So it's difficult to sort of parse that out very quickly for you, but yeah, there are important differences for sure. Yeah.
Okay, I think we should stop. Please read the book. It's really spectacular. We barely scratched the surface. please think about Marx and law after this week. And above all, thank you.